when we think of the war in Ukraine and what we can think of it as it could have been avoided if United States accepted Russia being part of NATO. In your opinion, why did the United States decided to continue this animosity toward Russia and not letting them into the NATO?
Well, I think it's clear the United States, in retrospect, never wanted to be friends with Russia. First of all, remember NATO's original purpose. I think it was Lord Esme, a British officer who became the first Secretary General of NATO. He said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Germans down, keep the Russians out, and keep the Americans in. So, the idea was to suppress Europe becoming a viable counter or a viable player on the global scene, keeping Germany down. Germany, of course, being the European nation with the strongest potential economy, the strongest military potential. So keep them down, keep the Americans in, knowing that America had especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, very strong isolationist tendencies. People who study how America got into the war, Second World War, need to understand how difficult it was for President Roosevelt to overcome these isolationist tendencies. Americans just didn't want to get involved in Europe's wars. So NATO was a vehicle to keep America in Europe. For what purpose? To keep the Germans down and to keep the Russians out. There was a lot of concern about how powerful the Soviet Union had become as a result of the Second World War. Its presence in Eastern Europe was considered by, especially Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, and Truman's British counterpart, at least for a little while, Winston Churchill. They both viewed Russia's presence in Eastern Europe as a threat to the rest of Europe. It's totally this notion was totally detached from reality. I mean, anybody who knew what the Soviet Union had gone through in the Second World War, 27 million dead. It's huge swaths of its territory totally devastated by war. A nation literally exhausted by this conflict. The idea that the Soviet Union was going to somehow seek to now confront the United States, Great Britain, France, and the other Western European nations in a global or in a war of conquest in Europe. Stupid, beyond stupid, lunacy. But Winston Churchill gave his famous speech in Missouri, the Iron Curtain speech, and George Kennan wrote his long telegram encouraging the containment of the Soviet Union. He was talking more about ideological containment, but it was then seized on by Paul Nietzsche and others, and they turned it into military containment. And NATO is the vehicle of military containment. And so now you have NATO created. NATO exists for more than 3 decades before the Soviet Union collapses. NATO had become not just a military alliance, but a political military alliance linked to some very influential institutions. The European Union, which is an economic/political European entity, was seen as an extension of NATO. The G7 was an expression of NATO in terms of global economics. NATO was in the DNA of Europe and defined the European relationship with the United States, this transatlantic relationship alliance that existed. So when the reason for NATO's continued existence disappeared overnight. 1989, Berlin Wall goes down, Germany's unified. You ain't keeping Germany down anymore. And then 1992, the Soviet Union goes away. Russia's there. Russia's not threatening anything. It's removed from the Warsaw Pact. You're not keeping Russia out. Why does NATO exist? What's its purpose? Literally, it had no purpose. None. And yet, NATO defined everything. The entire European-American relationship was centered on NATO. You can't get rid of it because it defines everything. But how do you have a military alliance that used the threat of the Soviet Union as the vehicle upon which to generate fear, to get people to spend money into building these massive, militaries? How do you continue that? Well, the first thing is everybody started to disarm. The peace dividend. Everybody wanted the peace dividend. And so the military aspect of NATO was gradually lessened. But it's still a military alliance, but it's gradually lessened. It now becomes a military political alliance that seeks to spread democracy, spread the rule of law, to spread the Western European American vision of how the world should operate. And the best way to do this is by moving into the vacuum created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, these Eastern European countries. There was concern what would happen if you allowed these countries to develop on their own, to actually become expressions of what they want. The conflict in Yugoslavia serves as an expression of this. Europe couldn't trust the Yugoslav nation to naturally evolve in a post-Tito environment. They had to get involved and forcibly break apart Yugoslavia and take control of the constituent components. And the reason why I bring this up is that's the model that everybody had for Russia, especially the United States. People need to understand we did not want Russia to exist as this massive federation. Even though it wasn't the Soviet Union anymore, it's still a huge landmass with tremendous resources, tremendous natural resources, and the potential of Russia getting on its feet and resuming the role that the Soviet Union played in the world was unacceptable in the West. So Yugoslavia was a dry run, not a dry run, a rehearsal for what we wanted to happen in Russia. And remember, we were doing it. This isn't theoretical. The conflict in Chechnya was, especially the second Chechen conflict, was 100% CIA driven for the purpose of destabilizing Chechnya, getting it to be torn from the Russian Federation, thereby triggering successive uprisings within the Russian Federation by minorities such as the Tatars, the Bashkirs, the Buryats, and others, and have this whole Russian thing fall apart, just like Yugoslavia. That was the goal. Now, if that's your goal, why would you invite Russia to join NATO? Why would you ever say, hey, Russia, we believe in peace and stability, and we want to peacefully coexist with you, and we want you to thrive as a fellow member of NATO. Come on in, join the party. No, because the party ain't bring stability to Russia. The party is destabilize Russia. And NATO became a vehicle to achieve that. That's NATO's purpose. The expansion of NATO, we knew what NATO expansion would mean to Russia. It would be seen as a direct threat to Russia. Now, we kept trying to tell the Russians, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. But Russia's looking at Yugoslavia saying, oh, we're very afraid. We don't want that. And remember how weak Russia was in the 1990s, how weak they were in the immediate aftermath of the post-Soviet era. And that weakness came not only from the dysfunction of the former Soviet area, the regions, including Russia, but also because of the policy of the United States and Europe to go in and destabilize, to steal wealth, remove it from Russia, do not reinvest it into Russia, suppressing the Russian economic potential to create general unrest that could be exploited to achieve the breakup of Russia. That was the CIA's vision towards Russia. That was the official policy of the United States and by extension, the policy of NATO. Straight up, that's it. The destruction of Russia. So why, and people keep saying, well, then why did Russia act? Well, asked to go in. Well, I think we should know by now that one of the smartest men, one of the greatest men of this century is Vladimir Putin. I'm not one of these people that worships the guy. He's not my president. He's Russia's president. Okay? Not my problem. But you have to recognize greatness when you see it. And every time this man gives a press conference, every time this man speaks, I listen and I'm going, there's a brain attached to that mouth. He's a smart guy. He's a great guy. He saved Russia. If you're a Russian and you don't recognize that Vladimir Putin is the savior of modern Russia, you're an idiot. Go, leave Russia. They don't need you. They don't want you. And I'm not saying that this is not a cult of personality, although it could be. He's been there for more than 2 decades, but he doesn't even want the cult of personality. What he wanted to do is save Russia. He did. He saved Russia. He is the only reason why Russia exists today in its current form. He took Russia out of the disaster that was the 1990s, and he's turned it into this remarkable country that it is today. But, so when Putin said, hey, why don't we join NATO? A lot of, in the West, to show you how ignorant we are in the West, they went, see, old Putin's weak, baby. He's weak. He's scared. He wants to join the club. He's nervous. And so we then, played games saying, well, we can't join, but we'll create this forum for you, a NATO-Russian engagement forum where you can sit here and pretend to be part of NATO. We can give you a seat at the table. We'll send somebody to Moscow and we'll pretend to be your friend all the while we're plotting to destroy your country, which is why Putin asked the question. Because he was confronting them with their hypocrisy. They claimed to be about stability. They claimed to be about creating bridges and friendship. The easiest way to do that would have been to invite Russia to join. But if you invited Russia to join, then NATO would have no reason to exist. Why have a military alliance when there's no military threat? To have a military alliance, you need a military threat. And the only threat that's there, that's viable, that can unite Europe is Russia. And that's the secret of NATO. It only can exist if there's a Russian threat. That's it. So now we come up to the first part of your question. Could this war have been avoided? Russia did everything possible to avoid this war. Russia did not want this war, but this war could not have been avoided. Under no circumstances could this war have been avoided. Why? Because this war was the policy objective of the United States and NATO all along. They wanted this war, and we know they wanted this war because in 2008, William Burns, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, straight up said, if you invite Ukraine in, you will invite a set of circumstances that will inevitably lead to a Russian military incursion into Ukraine. We knew by inviting them, this would lead to a war between Russia and Ukraine. And then we did everything possible to make this war happen. We provoked the 2014 coup d'etat in Kiev, removing a constitutionally elected pro-Russian leader, replacing them with neo-Nazi CIA acolytes who had been working with the CIA for decades since the 1940s. We brought them in. We promoted an anti-terrorist operation against Ukraine's own people, the ethnic Russians of the Donbass, of Crimea, anti-terrorist operation. They stopped being viewed by these neo-Nazis as citizens, and they became terrorist criminals. A war was started, a war which Vladimir Putin, the savior of Russia, said in 2005, straight up, I have been tasked with defending the Russian nation, not just the Russian people, the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is defined by ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, Orthodox people, people who have a shared cultural and history with the rest of Russia. Whether you are a Russian, whether you are an Udmurt, whether you are a Bashkir, whether you are a Ukrainian, it doesn't matter. You're part of the Russian nation. So when these Nazis in Kiev declared war against the people of the Russian nation, Russia had no choice but to step in. But how did they step in? To destroy Ukraine? No. To preserve the Russian people, the Russian nation. Minsk Accords were designed to sustain the sovereignty of Ukraine. All Putin and Russia said is we want these people to have rights. We want them to have the rights that should be afforded to the Russian nation, rights of freedom of religion, freedom of language, freedom of association, but they will be part of Ukraine. That wasn't good enough. Now we know the Ukrainian government wasn't going to accept that. But Poroshenko lied. He said, yeah, I believe in Minsk. He never signed it. He was backed by Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, a French and German, who said it was a sham the whole time. A sham to do what? Build up a NATO army. Ukraine's military went from, 15,000 in 2014 to 260,000 by 2022, trained, equipped, motivated, organized for the sole purpose of being a NATO proxy to attack Russia. Russia didn't want this war. NATO wanted this war. The United States wanted this war. And there was literally nothing Russia could have done to avoid this. Had Russia not intervened in a preemptive war of self-defense. This was preemptive self-defense. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter clearly allows this. Russia did not violate international law. This is not a war of aggression. It's a war of self-defense against NATO and the United States and Ukraine, who came together to try and destroy the Russian people of the Donbass, to take Crimea away from Russia. This war could not have been avoided. This was a necessary conflict, a tragic conflict, but a necessary conflict. Necessary because without this, Russia would have invited its own demise, to strip Ukraine away, to destroy the, spiritual and intellectual core of what it means to be Russian. They couldn't allow that, just like we couldn't allow it. We, the United States, could not allow Brazil to come up to Mexico and use the Mexicans to seek to create problems in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California to try and strip those lands away from the United States. That would be the end of the United States. And we would destroy Brazil for doing this. We would launch nuclear weapons against Brazil for doing this. So why in God's name do people think that suddenly Russia's going to sit back and let this happen? It isn't going to happen. This war was inevitable. Russia didn't want this war. They tried everything possible to prevent this war. But at the end of the day, because of the policies of the United States, NATO, and Ukraine, Russia had no choice to fight this war, and they had no choice but to win this war.